The October sun filtered through the stained glass windows of Magnolia Grove Baptist Church, casting fractured rainbows across the worn wooden pews where 37 souls sat in rapt attention. Reverend Samuel Washington stood behind the pulpit, his deep voice carrying the weight of conviction that had drawn people to this small sanctuary for 5 years running. But today, something felt different. The words came slower, each syllable measured as if he were savoring them, storing them away like precious coins in a vault he might never open again. "Brothers and sisters," Samuel's voice resonated through the humid Georgia air. "Sometimes the Lord calls us to walk through valleys so dark we can't see our own feet. But faith." He paused, his dark eyes scanning the congregation, lingering on his wife Clara's worried face in the third row. Faith is not about seeing the path. Faith is about trusting the one who lights it. Clara Washington shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her Sunday dress clinging to her skin in the oppressive heat. Something in her husband's tone made her stomach clench with familiar dread. She had noticed the change in Samuel over the past month, the way he stayed up late in his study, the hushed phone calls that ended abruptly when she entered the room, the letters he burned in the backyard fire pit without explanation. Now, watching him grip the pulpit's edges until his knuckles went white, she felt the terrible certainty that whatever had been eating at him was about to devour them all. "The question ain't whether storms will come," Samuel continued, his preacher's cadence building momentum. "The question is, when they do, will you stand firm in your convictions, or will you let fear blow you away like leaves in the wind?" His gaze found Thomas Grant, the elderly deacon who had become his closest confidant, sitting in his usual spot by the window. Thomas's weathered face was etched with concern, and Samuel saw in those tired eyes the reflection of his own inner turmoil. The congregation murmured their agreement, fans fluttering like butterfly wings as they tried to combat the stifling heat. Outside, the Georgia countryside stretched endlessly, cotton fields giving way to pine forests where shadows grew long and secrets festered. This was 1973, and though the Civil Rights Act had been law for nearly a decade, change moved slower than molasses in these rural corners of the South. Samuel knew this better than most. He had felt the sting of hatred disguised as tradition, had received the anonymous letters that promised violence if he didn't know his place. But what his congregation didn't know, what even Clara didn't fully understand, was that Samuel's battles extended far beyond the predictable racism of small-town Georgia. For months, he had been secretly counseling women whose husbands beat them, providing safe haven for children who bore the marks of unspeakable abuse. He had discovered a network of corruption that reached from the courthouse to the police station, a web of silence that protected predators and punished victims. The weight of these secrets pressed down on him like a physical force, making every breath an effort. "I want to tell you about Moses," Samuel said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper, forcing his congregation to lean forward. When God called him to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, Moses didn't feel ready. He stuttered, he doubted, he tried to convince God to choose someone else. But you know what God told him? Samuel's eyes glistened with unshed tears. God said, "I will be with you," not "I might be with you" or "I'll think about being with you." God said, "I will be with you." In the back pew, 16-year-old Michael Henderson watched his pastor with the intensity of youth trying to decode adult mysteries. Something about Reverend Washington's sermon felt like goodbye, though Michael couldn't articulate why. Perhaps it was the way the preacher's eyes lingered on each face as if memorizing them, or how his usual animated gestures seemed more deliberate, more final. Michael had grown up in this church, had been baptized in the creek behind the building by Samuel's own hands, and he had never heard his pastor preach with such desperate urgency. Clara's mind wandered to the conversation she had overheard 3 nights ago when Samuel thought she was asleep. He had been on the phone with someone, his voice tense and low. "I can't keep quiet about this anymore. These children deserve better. If something happens to me, you make sure Clara and the kids are taken care of." When she had confronted him the next morning, Samuel had kissed her forehead and said, "Sometimes a man has to do what's right, even when it's dangerous." The memory sent chills down her spine, despite the sweltering heat. "The children of Israel wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, Samuel continued, his sermon building toward its crescendo. 40 years! Can you imagine? But God never left them. Even when they complained, even when they doubted, even when they built golden calves and forgot who delivered them from bondage, God remained faithful." His voice cracked slightly, and he cleared his throat before continuing. "That's the kind of God we serve, church. A God who keeps his promises even when we can't see how he's working." Outside, a car engine rumbled past the church, and Samuel's head turned sharply toward the sound. For just a moment, fear flickered across his features before he composed himself. Clara noticed the gesture and felt her heart rate quicken. She had seen that same look of barely controlled terror too many times lately, usually when unknown vehicles lingered too long in front of their house or when the phone rang after midnight with only silence on the other end. As Samuel launched into his closing prayer, his words took on the weight of benediction and farewell. "Lord, we thank you for this day, for this church family, for the privilege of serving in your kingdom. We ask that you watch over each person in this sanctuary, that you protect them and guide them in the days to come. And if any of us should face trials that seem too heavy to bear, remind us that you are our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble." His voice broke completely on the last words, and several congregation members exchanged worried glances. The service ended with the usual hymn, "Blessed Assurance," but even the familiar melody seemed tinged with melancholy. As the congregation filed out, stopping to shake Samuel's hand and comment on his powerful message, Clara noticed how tightly he gripped each person's fingers, how long he held their gaze. Mrs. Patterson, the church pianist, mentioned that it was one of the finest sermons she had ever heard, and Samuel's response chilled Clara to the bone. "Thank you, Sister Patterson. I pray you'll remember it." When the last congregant had departed and the church stood empty except for the Washington family, Samuel walked slowly down the center aisle, his footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. Their 3 children, Marcus, age 12, Angela, age 9, and little David, only 6, chattered excitedly about Sunday dinner plans, oblivious to the undercurrent of tension that had permeated the service. Clara gathered the hymn books while Samuel stood at the altar, his head bowed in what appeared to be prayer, but felt more like mourning. "Samuel," Clara called softly, her voice barely audible over the children's voices. "You coming?" He looked up at her, and for a moment she saw not the confident pastor who had just delivered a sermon that would be talked about for weeks, but the frightened man who had been pacing their bedroom floor at 3 in the morning, wrestling with demons she couldn't name. "I'll be along directly," he said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Just need a moment with the Lord." Clara herded the children toward the door, but something made her turn back. Samuel was kneeling at the altar now, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She had never seen her husband, her rock, her anchor, look so utterly broken. The urge to run to him, to demand answers, to force him to share whatever burden was destroying him from the inside, nearly overwhelmed her. But something in his posture warned her away, told her that this was a conversation between Samuel and God alone. As the Washington family walked toward their modest home next to the church, the October sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Samuel emerged from the church 20 minutes later, his composure restored, but his eyes still haunted. At dinner, he told stories that made the children laugh, asked about their school week, and helped David with his reading lesson. To any observer, it would have seemed like a perfectly ordinary Sunday evening in rural Georgia. But Clara noticed that Samuel barely touched his food, that his laughter came a beat too late, and that he kept glancing toward the windows as if expecting uninvited visitors. After the children were in bed, he sat on the front porch longer than usual, smoking his pipe and staring into the darkness. When Clara joined him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the evening chill, he pulled her close and whispered, "Whatever happens, Clara, remember that I love you and those babies more than life itself. Remember that everything I do to protect this family and this community." "Samuel, you're scaring me," she whispered back, but he only kissed the top of her head and said, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, just like we sang today." Those were the last coherent words Clara Washington would ever hear her husband speak. By morning, Reverend Samuel Washington had vanished as completely as if the earth had swallowed him whole, leaving behind only questions that would haunt Magnolia Grove Baptist Church for the next 50 years. Clara Washington woke to the sound of rain against the bedroom window and the cold realization that she was alone. The space beside her in their marriage bed was empty, the sheets unrumpled, as if Samuel had never come to bed at all. She lay still for a moment, listening for the familiar sounds of her husband's morning routine, the creak of floorboards in his study, the rustle of papers as he prepared for the day, the soft humming of hymns that always accompanied his morning devotions. But the house was silent, except for the steady drumming of October rain on the roof. "Samuel," she called out, her voice echoing in the empty hallway. No response. Clara wrapped her robe around her shoulders and padded through the house, checking each room with growing unease. His study was exactly as he had left it the night before, books scattered across the desk, his reading glasses folded beside an open Bible, his coffee cup still half full and stone cold. The children were still sleeping, their innocent faces peaceful in the grey morning light. But Samuel was nowhere to be found. By 7 o'clock, when Samuel should have been preparing for his Monday morning Bible study, Clara's concern had transformed into something approaching panic. She called Thomas Grant, the church deacon, who had become Samuel's closest friend and advisor. Thomas's voice was thick with sleep when he answered, but it quickly sharpened when Clara explained the situation. "Now, Sister Clara, you know how Samuel is," Thomas said, though his tone lacked conviction. "Maybe he went for one of his long walks to clear his head. You know how he's been lately, all that weight on his shoulders." But even as he spoke the words, Thomas felt a chill of premonition. He had seen the fear in Samuel's eyes during yesterday's service, had noticed how his friend's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the pulpit. Something had been terribly wrong, and now Thomas feared they were about to discover just how wrong. Within an hour, word had spread through the small community like wildfire. Magnolia Grove Baptist Church might have been a predominantly black congregation in rural Georgia, but Samuel Washington had earned respect across racial lines during his 5 years of ministry. He had officiated at interracial marriages when no other pastor would, had quietly provided food and clothing to poor families regardless of their color, and had somehow managed to build bridges in a community where such connections were rare and dangerous. Mrs. Patterson, the church pianist, arrived at the Washington home carrying a casserole and a heart full of worry. "I keep thinking about yesterday's sermon," she told Clara as they sat in the living room, rain pattering against the windows. "The way he talked about Moses, about doing what's right even when it's dangerous. Lord, forgive me, but I'm scared he's gotten himself mixed up in something he couldn't handle." By noon, an impromptu search party had formed. Church members, along with several white families from town who had come to respect Samuel's ministry, combed the woods behind the church and walked the country roads calling his name. The rain had stopped, but the ground remained muddy and treacherous. Marcus, Samuel's 12-year-old son, insisted on joining the search despite his mother's protests. The boy's face was set with determination that reminded Clara painfully of his father. "He's got to be somewhere," Marcus said, his voice cracking with the strain of trying to sound grown up. "Daddy wouldn't just leave us. He wouldn't." Clara pulled her son close, feeling the weight of questions she couldn't answer. Where could Samuel have gone? Why hadn't he left a note? And most terrifying of all, had he left willingly, or had something terrible happened to him? Sheriff William Hayes arrived at the Washington home around 2 o'clock, his massive frame filling the doorway as he removed his hat with practiced solemnity. Hayes was a man of the old school, born and raised in Magnolia Grove, shaped by traditions that ran deeper than law or justice. He had been sheriff for 15 years, and his approach to law enforcement was colored by the unspoken hierarchies that governed small-town Southern life. "Mrs. Washington," he said, his voice carrying the patronizing tone that black residents of Magnolia Grove knew all too well, "I understand your husband has gone missing." The way he said it made Clara's skin crawl, as if Samuel's disappearance was somehow a personal failing rather than a tragedy. "He's been gone since sometime last night," Clara explained, trying to keep her voice steady. "This isn't like him, Sheriff Hayes. Samuel would never leave without telling me where he was going, especially not with the children to think about." Hayes nodded, but Clara could see the skepticism in his pale blue eyes. "Well now, Mrs. Washington, you know how it is with men sometimes. They get to feeling restless, start thinking about greener pastures. Maybe your husband just needed some time to think things through." The implication hung in the air like smoke, that Samuel had simply abandoned his family, that his disappearance was voluntary, and therefore not really a police matter. Thomas Grant, who had been listening from the kitchen doorway, stepped forward with barely controlled anger. "Sheriff, Reverend Washington is not some deadbeat who runs out on his responsibilities. The man has been preaching in this community for 5 years, has built up this church from nothing, has earned the respect of people across this county. Something has happened to him." Hayes's expression hardened at the challenge to his authority. "Now, Thomas, I know you and the Reverend are friends, but facts are facts. Man disappears without a trace, no signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play. That usually means he left on his own steam. I've seen it plenty of times before. Have you seen it with men like Samuel Washington?" Thomas shot back. "Men who've dedicated their lives to serving others, men who've never shown a moment's selfishness or cowardice." The tension in the room was palpable. Two men from different worlds staring each other down across a chasm of mutual distrust. Clara intervened before the confrontation could escalate. "Sheriff Hayes, I'm not asking you to assume anything. I'm asking you to investigate. Check with the bus station, talk to people who might have seen him, look for any trace of where he might have gone. Please." Her voice broke on the last word, and for a moment Hayes's expression softened slightly. "I'll make some calls," he said finally. "But Mrs. Washington, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that your husband might not want to be found. Sometimes men get to carrying burdens they can't handle, and they make decisions that don't make sense to the rest of us." After Hayes left, Clara sat in her kitchen, surrounded by concerned church members who had no idea how to help. The casseroles were piling up on the counter. The phone was ringing constantly with calls from worried congregants, and her children were asking questions she couldn't answer. 9-year-old Angela kept asking when Daddy was coming home, while 6-year-old David seemed to sense that something was terribly wrong and clung to his mother's skirt with desperate fingers. As evening approached, the search parties returned with nothing to report. No one had seen Samuel on any of the roads leading out of town. The bus station attendant, a nervous young man named Jimmy Collins, swore that no black passengers had purchased tickets in the past 2 days. The train station was 20 miles away, but phone calls there yielded the same result. No one matching Samuel's description had been seen. "It's like he just vanished into thin air," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice hollow with exhaustion. "How does a man just disappear without leaving any trace?" Thomas Grant had been thinking the same thing, but his thoughts were taking a darker turn. He remembered the mysterious phone calls Samuel had been receiving, the way his friend had seemed increasingly anxious in recent weeks, the cryptic comments about doing what was right even when it was dangerous. What if Samuel hadn't left voluntarily? What if someone had made him disappear? That night, after the last well-meaning visitor had departed, Clara sat alone in Samuel's study, surrounded by his books and papers, breathing in the faint scent of his cologne that still lingered in the air. She opened his desk drawers, looking for clues, for anything that might explain where he had gone or why. What she found instead made her blood run cold. Hidden beneath a stack of sermon notes was a manila envelope containing newspaper clippings about civil rights workers who had been murdered in Mississippi and Alabama. There were also handwritten notes in Samuel's careful script, documenting conversations with women who had been abused by their husbands, children who had been molested by trusted adults, and a pattern of corruption that reached from the local police department to the courthouse. At the bottom of the envelope was a list of names, prominent citizens of Magnolia Grove who were apparently involved in activities that Samuel had discovered. Clara's hand shook as she read through the materials. She had known that Samuel was counseling troubled families, but she had never understood the full scope of what he had uncovered. The man she had married, the gentle pastor who read bedtime stories to their children and never raised his voice in anger, had been conducting a secret investigation into the darkest corners of their community. And now he was gone. The next morning brought Sheriff Hayes back to the Washington home, but not with the news Clara had hoped for. "I've checked with the surrounding counties," he reported, his hat in his hands and his expression carefully neutral. "No one's seen hide nor hair of your husband. Bus stations, train stations, even the airport in Atlanta. Nothing. Far as I can tell, Reverend Washington just up and vanished." "What about his car?" Clara asked. "Did you check to see if his car is missing?" Hayes looked uncomfortable. "Well now, Mrs. Washington, that's the thing. Your husband's car is still parked right out there in your driveway. Keys are hanging on the hook by your front door, just like always. Wherever he went, he didn't drive there." This information sent a chill through everyone present. If Samuel hadn't taken his car, how had he left Magnolia Grove? The nearest town was 15 miles away, and the roads were dark and dangerous at night. The possibility that he had simply walked away seemed increasingly unlikely. As the days turned into weeks, the initial surge of community support began to wane. People had their own lives to worry about, their own problems to solve. The search parties grew smaller and less frequent. Sheriff Hayes made perfunctory inquiries, but seemed increasingly convinced that Samuel had abandoned his family. The case, such as it was, grew cold. Clara found herself caught between grief and hope, between the need to mourn her husband and the possibility that he might still be alive somewhere. The children adapted with the resilience of youth, but she could see the toll their father's absence was taking. Marcus had grown sullen and angry, lashing out at his younger siblings and withdrawing from the activities he had once enjoyed. Angela had begun having nightmares, and little David had stopped talking altogether. The church, too, was struggling. Without their pastor, the congregation floundered. Guest speakers filled the pulpit on Sundays, but none could replace the man who had built Magnolia Grove Baptist Church from a handful of families into a thriving community. Attendance began to drop, and whispered conversations in the pews often centered on the same question: where was Reverend Washington? Some members, like Thomas Grant, held on to their faith in Samuel's character and continued to believe that something terrible had happened to him. Others, influenced by Sheriff Hayes' skepticism and the complete absence of evidence, began to wonder if perhaps their beloved pastor had indeed abandoned them. The uncertainty was poison to a community that had looked to Samuel for answers and guidance. As October turned to November and November to December, Clara Washington faced the possibility that she might never know what had happened to her husband. The man who had stood in the pulpit just months before, preaching about faith in the face of uncertainty, had become the ultimate test of that very faith. Could she trust in God's plan when that plan seemed to include the inexplicable disappearance of the man she loved? Could she raise their children alone, always wondering if Samuel might walk through the door at any moment? The last entry in Samuel's journal, which Clara found weeks after his disappearance, was dated the night before he vanished. It read simply, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." Below that, in handwriting that seemed to tremble with emotion, he had written, "Clara, if something happens to me, know that I love you and the children more than life itself. What I do for them, and for all the children who have no voice. May God forgive me for the pain I'm about to cause, and may He watch over you when I cannot. Reading those words, Clara finally understood that Samuel's disappearance had not been sudden or impulsive. He had known something was coming, had prepared for it as best he could, and had chosen to face it rather than run from it. The question that would haunt her for the next 50 years was simple. What had he discovered that was worth dying for? Christmas morning 1973 arrived with a silence that felt heavier than snow. Clara Washington sat in the empty chair at the head of their kitchen table, staring at the 3 wrapped presents beneath their modest tree. Gifts Samuel had hidden weeks before his disappearance, his careful handwriting on each tag, a painful reminder of the man who should have been there to watch his children's faces light up. Marcus, now 13 and trying desperately to fill the void his father had left, attempted to maintain the family traditions, reading the Christmas story from Luke, while Angela and David listened with the solemn attention of children who had learned too early that life could change in an instant. The years that followed blurred together in a succession of birthdays without cake, father-daughter dances, where Clara stood alone taking pictures, and little league games, where David searched the bleachers for a face that would never appear. The community of Magnolia Grove learned to function around the absence of Samuel Washington the way a body learns to compensate for a missing limb, gradually, painfully, but never quite the same. The church struggled through a succession of interim pastors, men who meant well but could never quite fill the enormous shoes Samuel had left behind. By 1976, the search for Samuel had become more legend than investigation. Sheriff Hayes had officially closed the case, filing it under voluntary missing person, though he never quite explained how someone could voluntarily disappear without a trace. Clara had exhausted every lead, every possibility, every desperate hope. She had hired a private investigator with money borrowed from Thomas Grant, a kind man from Atlanta who spent 3 months combing through records and conducting interviews before concluding what everyone else already suspected, that Samuel Washington had vanished as completely as if he had never existed. The children adapted with the resilience that only the young possess, but each carried the scars of their father's absence in different ways. Marcus channeled his anger into athletics, becoming the star quarterback of his high school team and earning a scholarship to the University of Georgia. But Clara could see the hardness in his eyes, the way he flinched whenever anyone mentioned his father, the protective wall he had built around his heart to keep from being hurt again. Angela buried herself in books and music, becoming the pianist for Magnolia Grove Baptist Church at age 14, her fingers finding solace in hymns that Samuel had once hummed while shaving. David, the baby who had barely known his father, grew up with only stories and photographs, creating an idealized image of Samuel that no real man could have lived up to. Clara herself, aged 20 years in the first 5, her hair turning gray and her face developing lines that spoke of sleepless nights and unanswered prayers. She took a job at the local elementary school, teaching 3rd grade with a patience and gentleness that made her beloved by generations of children who never knew they were being mothered by a woman whose own heart had been shattered. She never remarried, though several kind men made overtures over the years. "How can I marry someone else when I don't know if I'm widow or abandoned wife?" she would ask Thomas Grant during their long conversations on the church porch. The church community rallied around the Washington family in ways both touching and complex. The women of the congregation took turns bringing meals and helping with the children, but Clara could sense the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room. Some believed Samuel had been murdered for his civil rights activities, making him a martyr in their eyes. Others, influenced by years of unanswered questions and Sheriff Hayes's persistent implications, wondered if perhaps the good Reverend had simply cracked under pressure and run away. The uncertainty poisoned relationships and created fault lines that would take decades to heal. Thomas Grant became the unofficial keeper of Samuel's memory, refusing to let anyone forget the man who had transformed their community. He maintained Samuel's study exactly as it had been left, dusting the books and keeping fresh flowers on the desk. Every Sunday, he would tell the children stories about their father, how Samuel had single-handedly raised money to fix the church roof, how he had personally driven elderly members to doctor's appointments, how he had stood up to local bullies who tried to intimidate black families. But even Thomas struggled with doubt as the years passed. In his darkest moments, usually late at night when sleep wouldn't come, he found himself wondering if he had really known Samuel Washington at all. The impact of Samuel's disappearance rippled through Magnolia Grove in ways that weren't immediately apparent. The interfaith cooperation he had fostered between the black and white churches gradually withered. The shelter he had quietly operated for abused women closed when no one else had the courage or connections to maintain it. The careful bridges he had built between racial communities began to crumble as people retreated into familiar divisions. It was as if the hope Samuel had represented had vanished along with the man himself. As Marcus graduated from high school in 1979, he shocked everyone by announcing his intention to study criminal justice. "I'm going to find out what happened to my father," he told his mother, with the fierce determination that reminded Clara painfully of Samuel. "Someone knows something, and I'm going to find them." Clara watched her eldest son prepare for a quest that had already consumed 6 years of their lives and knew she couldn't dissuade him. The need for answers had become as essential to Marcus as breathing. Angela's path was different, but no less shaped by her father's absence. She threw herself into social work, earning a degree from Spelman College and returning to Georgia to work with troubled families. Clara often wondered if Angela was trying to complete the work Samuel had started, helping the vulnerable people he could no longer protect. But Angela's dedication came at a personal cost. She struggled to form lasting relationships, always holding something back, afraid that anyone she loved might disappear as suddenly as her father had. David, meanwhile, grew up with the weight of being Samuel Washington's son, without any real memory of what that meant. Teachers and community members constantly told him how much he looked like his father, how he had inherited Samuel's gentle spirit and quick mind. By the time he reached high school in the early 1980s, David felt like he was living in the shadow of a ghost. The pressure to live up to an idealized memory of a man he barely remembered drove him to excel academically, but it also left him feeling disconnected from his own identity. The mystery of Samuel's disappearance became a sort of dark tourism attraction for the region. Occasionally, journalists would arrive from Atlanta or Birmingham, drawn by the story of the vanished pastor. They would interview Clara with barely concealed skepticism, clearly hoping to uncover some scandal that would explain the inexplicable. Surely he was involved with another woman, one particularly insensitive reporter suggested in 1981. Or maybe he was stealing from the church collection plate. Clara learned to recognize the signs of opportunistic journalism and eventually stopped granting interviews altogether. But perhaps the most painful aspect of the long years of not knowing was how Samuel's memory began to shift and change in the community's collective consciousness. Without his physical presence to anchor their memories, people began to project their own needs and fears onto his legacy. He became a symbol of different things to different people, a civil rights hero to some, a cautionary tale about getting involved in dangerous politics to others. The real Samuel Washington, with his gentle humor and human flaws, his love of detective novels and his terrible singing voice, gradually faded into mythology. The church itself struggled with Samuel's absence in ways that went beyond missing his pastoral leadership. Magnolia Grove Baptist Church had been Samuel's vision made manifest, a place where people could worship together regardless of their social status or personal history. Without his unifying presence, old tensions resurfaced. Families who had been brought together by Samuel's ministry began to drift apart. The vibrant community life that had characterized the church during his tenure gave way to routine Sunday services that felt hollow and perfunctory. In 1985, 12 years after Samuel's disappearance, Clara made a decision that shocked everyone who knew her. She announced her intention to apply to seminary, explaining that she felt called to ministry herself. "I've spent 12 years waiting for someone else to fill the hole Samuel left," she told Thomas Grant. "Maybe it's time I stopped waiting and started doing." The idea of a woman pastor was revolutionary in their conservative community, but Clara's decades of quiet service and evident faith had earned her a respect that transcended gender roles. Her decision to enter ministry was partly practical. The church desperately needed stable leadership, but it was also deeply personal. In learning to preach, to counsel, to provide spiritual guidance to others, Clara was attempting to understand the man she had married. She studied his sermons, read his theological books, tried to walk in his footsteps as literally as possible. If she couldn't find Samuel himself, perhaps she could find pieces of his spirit in the work he had loved. Marcus's investigation into his father's disappearance consumed his 20s and early 30s. He became a detective with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, using his professional resources to pursue leads that local law enforcement had long since abandoned. He interviewed elderly residents who might have information about the night Samuel vanished. He pored over police reports and newspaper clippings, looking for patterns that earlier investigators had missed. He even traveled to other states, following rumors of sightings that invariably led nowhere. The frustration of constantly hitting dead ends began to take its toll on Marcus's mental health and his relationships. He married a fellow law enforcement officer named Janet in 1987, but the marriage struggled under the weight of his obsession with his father's case. "You're in love with a ghost," Janet told him during one of their increasingly frequent arguments. "Samuel Washington has been dead for 15 years, but you won't let him rest, and you won't let yourself live." The marriage ended in divorce 3 years later, another casualty of Samuel's disappearance. Angela, meanwhile, found her own way of dealing with their family's trauma. She established a foundation in her father's name, providing support services for families dealing with domestic violence and child abuse. The Samuel Washington Foundation became her life's work, and through it, she felt connected to the mission that had apparently cost her father his life. But even as she helped other families heal from trauma, Angela struggled with her own unresolved grief and anger. How could a loving God allow a good man like her father to simply vanish? How could justice exist in a world where evil people prospered while the righteous disappeared without explanation? David's response was perhaps the most complex of all. Having grown up with only second-hand memories of his father, he developed an almost mystical relationship with Samuel's legacy. He became deeply religious, studying theology, and eventually feeling called to ministry himself. But his faith was complicated by the circumstances of his father's disappearance. How could he preach about God's love and protection when his own father had been neither loved nor protected? How could he counsel others about trusting in divine providence when providence had failed his family so spectacularly? As the 1980s gave way to the 1990s, the story of Samuel Washington's disappearance became a sort of foundational myth for Magnolia Grove. Parents told their children about the pastor who had vanished, though the details varied depending on who was telling the story. Some versions portrayed Samuel as a saint who had been martyred for his beliefs. Others suggested he had been involved in dangerous political activities that had finally caught up with him. Still others whispered that he had simply been unable to handle the pressures of ministry and family life. The truth, whatever it was, remained as elusive as ever. Clara, now in her 60s and serving as the pastor of Magnolia Grove Baptist Church, had learned to live with uncertainty in ways that would have seemed impossible during those first desperate months after Samuel's disappearance. She had raised 3 children who were successful and caring adults, though each bore invisible scars from their father's absence. She had built a ministry that honored Samuel's memory while addressing the needs of a new generation. She had found peace, if not answers. But late at night, when the house was quiet and her children were living their own lives in distant cities, Clara would sometimes sit in Samuel's old study and wonder what would have happened if he had confided in her completely. What if she had known about the investigation he was conducting, the dangers he was facing? Could she have convinced him to seek help, to involve law enforcement, to protect himself and his family? The questions were as persistent as they were unanswerable, ghosts that haunted the place where Samuel Washington had once wrestled with his own impossible choices. The renovation of Magnolia Grove Baptist Church in the spring of 2023 was supposed to be a simple project: new carpet, fresh paint, and repairs to the old wooden beams that had been sagging for decades. Reverend Sarah Washington Miller, Samuel's youngest daughter, who had followed in her grandmother Clara's footsteps into ministry, had raised the funds through a combination of community fundraising and a small grant from the State Historical Society. At 56, Sarah possessed her father's gentle spirit and her mother's fierce determination, though she had been only 3 years old when Samuel disappeared and retained no real memories of him beyond the stories and photographs that had shaped her childhood. The discovery came on a Tuesday morning in May, when contractor Billy Morrison was examining the wall behind Samuel's old desk in the pastoral study. The room had been preserved almost exactly as Samuel had left it 50 years earlier, turned into something between a shrine and a museum by the congregation's collective grief and Clara's insistence that her husband might someday return to find his things exactly where he had left them. Billy was checking for termite damage when his crowbar slipped, loosening a board that seemed slightly different from the others. "Reverend Sarah," Billy called out, his voice carrying an odd mixture of excitement and trepidation. "You might want to take a look at this." Sarah set down the box of old hymnals she had been sorting and joined Billy at the wall. Behind the loose board was a small cavity, and within that space was a manila envelope, yellowed with age and sealed with wax that had somehow survived 5 decades of Georgia humidity. Sarah's hands trembled as she carefully extracted the envelope. Her father's name was written across the front in his own distinctive handwriting, along with a single word that made her heart race: truth. She stared at the envelope for a long moment, acutely aware that whatever it contained had been hidden there intentionally, meant to be found someday by someone who would understand its significance. The weight of 50 years of unanswered questions seemed to press down on her shoulders as she carefully broke the wax seal. Inside the envelope were 3 items: a letter written in Samuel's careful script, a small notebook filled with names and dates, and a photograph that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. The photograph showed her father standing next to a young white woman who was holding a child, both of them bearing visible bruises. The woman's eyes held a mixture of fear and desperate hope that Sarah recognized from her years of counseling abuse victims. On the back of the photograph, in Samuel's handwriting, were the words, "Mary Ellen Patterson and daughter Lucy, September 1973, Safe House 3. But it was the letter that would change everything Sarah thought she knew about her father's disappearance. Written on church stationery in Samuel's distinctive style, it was dated October 20th, 1973, the night before he vanished. Sarah's hands shook as she read the words that would finally answer questions that had haunted her family for half a century. "My dearest Clara and precious children," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then the choice I have made has been discovered, and perhaps the truth can finally bring some peace to your hearts. I know that my disappearance has caused you unimaginable pain, and I pray that God will forgive me for the suffering I'm about to cause the people I love most in this world." Sarah sank into her father's old chair as she continued reading, her eyes filling with tears as Samuel's voice seemed to speak to her across the decades. "For the past 6 months, I have been operating an underground network to help women and children escape from abusive situations. What began as simple counseling has grown into something much larger and more dangerous. We have safe houses in 3 counties, volunteer drivers who transport families to new lives in other states, and a network of sympathetic doctors and lawyers who provide medical care and legal assistance under assumed names." The letter went on to detail a sophisticated operation that had helped dozens of families escape domestic violence and abuse. Samuel had been working with a group of activists from Atlanta, including civil rights workers and women's advocates, to create what they called the Freedom Railroad, a deliberate echo of the Underground Railroad that had helped enslaved people escape to freedom a century earlier. But this modern version was focused on helping women and children escape the prisons of abusive homes. The work has been more dangerous than I initially realized, Samuel's letter continued. Several of the men whose wives and children we have helped to relocate are prominent citizens with connections to law enforcement and local government. They have figured out that someone is helping their property escape, and they are determined to stop us. I have received death threats, my phone has been tapped, and I believe I'm being watched constantly. Yesterday, I learned that they know who I am and where I live. Sarah's mind raced as she absorbed the implications of what she was reading. Her father hadn't abandoned his family or run away from his responsibilities. He had been murdered for helping vulnerable people escape from violence. The man she had grown up hearing about as a gentle pastor had actually been operating a dangerous underground network that challenged some of the most powerful people in their community. The letter revealed that Samuel had been working closely with Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a psychiatrist from Atlanta who specialized in treating trauma victims, and Robert Jenkins, a civil rights lawyer who helped families establish new identities in other states. The network had successfully relocated 43 families over the course of 6 months, including several cases involving children who were being sexually abused by their fathers or stepfathers. The scope and sophistication of the operation was staggering, especially considering it had been organized and run by a small-town pastor with no formal training in covert operations. The notebook you will find with this letter contains the names and contact information for all the families we have helped, as well as the volunteers who have supported this work, Samuel wrote. I am hiding this information because I believe it will be necessary to protect these people if something happens to me. The men who are hunting us will not hesitate to hurt innocent people to get their revenge. Sarah turned to the notebook, her hands still trembling as she flipped through pages of careful documentation. Each entry contained the name of a family, the nature of their situation, the date they were relocated, and their new contact information. The stories were heartbreaking. Women who had been beaten nearly to death, children who had been sexually assaulted by trusted adults, families who had been trapped in cycles of violence for years before finding the courage to escape. But what shocked Sarah most were the names in the final section of the notebook, a list of men who had been identified as abusers and who posed ongoing threats to the network. Several of the names belonged to people she recognized from her childhood, men who had been respected members of the community, including a county commissioner, 2 police officers, and a prominent businessman who had served on the school board. The notebook also contained evidence of corruption that reached far beyond domestic violence. Bribes, illegal gambling operations, and even connections to organized crime. I know that what I am about to do will seem like abandonment to you, Samuel's letter concluded, but I cannot continue to put our family at risk. The men who are hunting me have made it clear that they will hurt you and the children to get to me. My only choice is to disappear completely, to make them believe that I have died or fled far away, so that they will leave you alone. I have arranged to meet with Robert Jenkins tonight to discuss relocating our entire family, but I fear it may be too late. The final paragraph of the letter was nearly illegible, as if Samuel had been writing in great haste or under extreme emotional stress. If I do not survive this night, please know that every choice I made was motivated by love. Love for you and our children, and love for all the children who have no voice. The work we have been doing is holy work, even if it has led us into danger. Tell Marcus, Angela, and David that their father died fighting for justice, not running from responsibility. And Clara, my beloved wife, forgive me for not finding another way. Sarah sat in stunned silence for several minutes after finishing the letter, the weight of revelation pressing down on her like a physical force. Her father hadn't been a man who cracked under pressure or abandoned his family in a moment of weakness. He had been a hero who sacrificed everything to protect vulnerable people, including his own wife and children. The gentle pastor she had grown up hearing about had actually been running a dangerous underground network that challenged powerful interests and ultimately cost him his life. The implications of the discovery were staggering. For 50 years, the Washington family had lived with uncertainty about Samuel's fate and questions about his character. Some people in the community had always suspected that he had simply run away, unable to handle the pressures of ministry and family life. Others had speculated about affairs or financial improprieties. But the truth was far more complex and tragic than anyone had imagined. Sarah realized that she was holding evidence of crimes that had never been investigated and corruption that had never been exposed. The notebook contained enough information to potentially reopen cold cases and pursue justice for victims who had been silenced for decades. But it also contained information that could put people at risk. Some of the families Samuel had helped might still be hiding under assumed identities, and some of the perpetrators named in the notebook might still be alive and dangerous. Her first instinct was to call her brothers immediately, to share this earth-shattering discovery with the people who had been most affected by their father's disappearance. But as she sat in the quiet study, surrounded by the books and papers that Samuel had left behind, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. This information was dangerous. It had cost her father his life 50 years ago, and it might still be dangerous today. She thought about her grandmother Clara, who had spent 30 years wondering if she was a widow or an abandoned wife before her death in 2003. Clara had died without ever knowing the truth about Samuel's disappearance, carrying the pain of uncertainty to her grave. Sarah thought about her brother Marcus, who had spent decades investigating their father's disappearance and had ultimately been forced to give up when every lead went cold. She thought about Angela, who had dedicated her life to helping abuse victims, as if trying to complete their father's work without ever knowing she was doing exactly that. The more Sarah considered the implications of what she had discovered, the more she realized that this was not just a family matter. The information in Samuel's notebook represented potential evidence of ongoing criminal activity and corruption. Some of the men named as abusers would now be in their 80s or 90s, but others might still be active. Some might have sons or grandsons who had inherited their positions of power and their willingness to abuse it. Sarah also realized that the story of the Freedom Railroad needed to be told, not just for the sake of her family's peace of mind, but as a testament to the courage of all the people who had risked their lives to help others. The women who had driven escape vehicles, the doctors who had treated patients under false names, the lawyers who had created new identities. All of these people deserved to have their heroism recognized, but first, she needed to process the emotional impact of learning that her father had been murdered for his principles. For 50 years, the Washington family had lived with questions about Samuel's character and commitment. Now, they knew that he had been willing to die rather than abandon vulnerable people who depended on him. The man they had mourned was even more worthy of their grief than they had ever imagined. As the afternoon sun streamed through the windows of Samuel's study, Sarah carefully photographed each page of the letter and notebook with her phone, creating digital copies before storing the originals in a safe deposit box. She knew that what happened next would change not only her family's understanding of their history, but potentially the entire community's understanding of its past. The truth that Samuel Washington had died to protect was finally ready to see the light, and Sarah Washington Miller was determined to ensure that his sacrifice would not be forgotten. The phone call that changed everything came at 6:30 on a Thursday morning in June 2023. Sarah had been awake for hours, poring over her father's notebook and trying to decide how to proceed with the explosive information she had discovered. When her phone buzzed with an unknown number, she almost didn't answer. But something compelled her to pick up, and the voice on the other end made her heart stop. "Is this Sarah Washington Miller?" The voice belonged to an elderly woman, shaky but determined. "My name is Mary Ellen Patterson. I believe your father saved my life 50 years ago, and I think it's time I told someone what really happened the night he disappeared." Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped the phone. Mary Ellen Patterson, the name from her father's notebook, the woman in the photograph with the bruised face and fearful eyes. "Mrs. Patterson, Yes, this is Sarah. I found my father's records. I know about the Freedom Railroad." There was a long pause before Mary Ellen spoke again, her voice heavy with decades of suppressed emotion. "I've been watching the news about your church renovation. When I saw your picture in the paper, you looked so much like your daddy that I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. That man died because of what he did for me and my daughter, and you deserve to know the truth." Within hours, Sarah was driving to a small town in North Carolina where Mary Ellen Patterson, now 73 years old, lived in a modest cottage surrounded by flower gardens. The woman who answered the door bore little resemblance to the terrified young mother in the photograph, but her eyes still held the haunted quality of someone who had seen the worst of human nature and survived. "Your daddy was the first person who ever told me that what my husband was doing to me and Lucy wasn't my fault," Mary Ellen said as they sat in her living room, surrounded by photographs of children and grandchildren who existed because Samuel Washington had helped their mother escape a life of violence. "I'd been married to Harold Patterson for 8 years, and every day of those 8 years, he beat me. When Lucy was born, I thought maybe he'd change. Instead, he started hurting her too." Sarah listened in stunned silence as Mary Ellen recounted a story of systematic abuse that had escalated to the point where she feared for her daughter's life. Harold Patterson had been a respected member of the community, a deacon at the Methodist Church, a successful insurance agent, and a man who presented a charming facade to the outside world while terrorizing his family behind closed doors. "I went to Pastor Washington in September of 1973, Mary Ellen continued, her voice growing stronger as she shared the burden she had carried alone for 5 decades. "I was desperate. Harold had started touching Lucy in ways that weren't right, and I knew I had to get her away from him, but I had no money, no family, nowhere to go. Your daddy listened to me for 3 hours that first day, and then he said something I'll never forget. 'Mrs. Patterson, you and Lucy are going to be safe. I promise you that.' What followed was a carefully orchestrated escape that involved multiple volunteers and safe houses across 3 states. Samuel had arranged for Mary Ellen and Lucy to be moved first to a farm outside Atlanta, then to a women's shelter in Tennessee, and finally to North Carolina, where they were given new identities and helped to start new lives. The operation had taken weeks of planning and involved a network of people who risked their own safety to help strangers escape from violence. But Harold wasn't the kind of man who let go of his property, Mary Ellen said, her voice dropping to a whisper. When he realized Lucy and I were gone, he went crazy. He hired private investigators. He threatened people. He even offered rewards for information about where we were. And somehow he figured out that your daddy was involved. Sarah felt a chill as Mary Ellen described the events of October 1973. Harold Patterson had discovered Samuel's involvement in his wife's escape and had contacted other men whose families had been helped by the Freedom Railroad. Together, they had formed what they called a citizens committee, dedicated to stopping what they saw as outside interference in their family affairs. "The night your daddy disappeared, Harold came to see me," Mary Ellen said, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "I was staying at a safe house about 20 miles from Magnolia Grove. He had found me somehow, and he was drunk and angry and talking about making examples of people who meddled in other people's business. He said he and his friends were going to teach your daddy a lesson that night. Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized what Mary Ellen was telling her. "Mrs. Patterson, are you saying that you know who killed my father?" Mary Ellen nodded slowly. "Harold told me exactly what they were planning to do. They were going to make it look like your daddy had run away so that no one would come looking for him. They had it all figured out. They would make him disappear completely, and everyone would assume he had abandoned his family." Harold was proud of how clever they thought they were. The details that Mary Ellen provided were horrifying in their specificity. Harold Patterson and 4 other men had been watching Samuel's house for weeks, learning his routines and waiting for the right opportunity. On the night of October 20th, 1973, they had intercepted Samuel as he walked from his house to meet with Robert Jenkins, the civil rights lawyer who was helping coordinate the Freedom Railroad. "Harold told me they grabbed your daddy on the old logging road behind the church," Mary Ellen said, her voice barely audible. "They took him to an abandoned farmhouse about 30 miles away. Harold said they wanted him to give them the names of everyone involved in helping families escape, but your daddy wouldn't talk. Even when they hurt him, he wouldn't give up any names." Sarah had to excuse herself to compose her emotions as Mary Ellen described the torture and murder of her father. Samuel had endured hours of brutality rather than compromise the safety of the people he had been helping. His killers had eventually realized that he would die before betraying the network, so they had killed him and disposed of his body in a way that would ensure it was never found. "Harold was drunk when he told me all this," Mary Ellen continued when Sarah returned to the living room. "I think he wanted to scare me, to make sure I never tried to contact anyone from my old life. He said they had weighted your daddy's body down and dropped it in a quarry that was scheduled to be filled in with concrete the next week. He said no one would ever find him." The location Mary Ellen described was specific enough to be credible. A limestone quarry owned by Patterson Construction Company that had been filled and turned into a parking lot for a shopping center in 1974. Sarah realized that her father's body was probably still there, entombed beneath tons of concrete and asphalt in a location that had been hiding in plain sight for 50 years. But Mary Ellen's revelations didn't end with the details of Samuel's murder. She also provided information about the other men involved in the conspiracy, including their roles in covering up the crime and intimidating potential witnesses. The group had included County Commissioner Frank Morrison, Police Sergeant James Butler, businessman and school board member Robert Hayes, and KKK member turned respectable citizen William Grant, ironically the younger brother of Thomas Grant, Samuel's closest friend and confidant. "They thought they were so smart," Mary Ellen said bitterly. "They figured that with Harold being a deacon and Frank being a county commissioner, nobody would ever suspect them of murder. And they were right. Nobody ever did suspect them. Your daddy's death was written off as a missing person case, and life went on like nothing had happened." Sarah's mind reeled as she processed the implications of what she was learning. Not only had her father been murdered by a conspiracy of prominent citizens, but the cover-up had involved law enforcement and local government officials. The investigation into Samuel's disappearance had been deliberately sabotaged from the beginning, ensuring that the truth would never come to light. But Mary Ellen had more shocking revelations to share. Over the years, she had kept in contact with some of the other families who'd been helped by the Freedom Railroad, and she had learned that Harold Patterson and his co-conspirators had continued their reign of terror long after Samuel's murder. Families who tried to escape abusive situations found themselves pursued by private investigators and threatened with violence. Several women had been forced to return to their abusers when their hiding places were discovered. They turned hunting down escaped families into a business, Mary Ellen explained. Harold started a private investigation company that specialized in family reunification. That's what they called dragging women and children back to their abusers. They worked with other men across the South who had the same problem with uppity wives and children who thought they could just leave. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. What had begun as revenge against Samuel Washington had evolved into a systematic effort to destroy the network he had helped create and to terrorize anyone who tried to help abuse victims escape. The men responsible had used their positions of authority and respectability to operate with impunity for decades. Sarah realized that she needed professional help to properly investigate and document these revelations. She contacted Detective Marcus Thompson of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, a black detective who specialized in cold cases and had a reputation for persistence and integrity. When she explained what she had discovered, Thompson immediately understood the significance of the information. "Mrs. Miller, what you're describing isn't just a 50-year-old murder case," Thompson told her during their first meeting. "You're talking about a criminal conspiracy that may have continued for decades. Some of these people might still be alive, and some of their victims might still be suffering." Thompson's investigation began with verifying Mary Ellen Patterson's story through official records and contemporary documents. He was able to confirm that Patterson Construction Company had indeed filled a quarry in late 1973, and that the timing matched Mary Ellen's account of Samuel's murder. He also discovered that several of the men she had named as conspirators had indeed formed business partnerships and political alliances that would have given them the power to cover up serious crimes. But the most shocking discovery came when Thompson began looking into the private investigation company that Harold Patterson had started after Samuel's murder. Patterson Family Services had operated for nearly 20 years, and their client files contained evidence of systematic intimidation and violence against abuse victims who had tried to escape their situations. The company had worked with similar organizations across the South, creating what amounted to a network of professional stalkers and kidnappers who specialized in returning women and children to abusive homes. "This wasn't just about revenge against your father," Thompson explained to Sarah as they reviewed the evidence. "These men saw the Freedom Railroad as a threat to their entire way of life. They believed they had a right to control their families through violence, and they were willing to kill to protect that right." The investigation also revealed that Samuel's murder had not been an isolated incident. Thompson discovered evidence linking Harold Patterson and his co-conspirators to at least 3 other murders of civil rights activists and domestic violence advocates between 1973 and 1980. The men had developed a pattern of making their victims disappear completely, ensuring that their deaths would be written off as missing person cases rather than investigated as homicides. As the investigation progressed, Sarah found herself grappling with emotions she had never expected to feel. Learning the truth about her father's death was both liberating and devastating. On one hand, she finally understood that Samuel had been a hero who died protecting innocent people. On the other hand, she was confronted with the reality that his killers had lived full lives, enjoyed successful careers, and died peacefully in their beds without ever facing justice for their crimes. But perhaps the most difficult aspect of the investigation was learning about the ongoing impact of her father's murder. The destruction of the Freedom Railroad had left countless abuse victims without help, and many had paid the ultimate price for their inability to escape dangerous situations. Thompson's investigation uncovered evidence of women who had been murdered by their abusers after failed escape attempts, children who had been sexually assaulted for years because their mothers couldn't find help, and families who had been trapped in cycles of violence that might have been broken if Samuel's network had continued to operate. The weight of this knowledge was almost unbearable for Sarah. Her father had died trying to save people, but his death had ultimately doomed many of the people he had been trying to help. The men who killed him had not only ended his life, they had destroyed a network of hope and safety that had represented the only chance for survival for countless abuse victims. As the investigation neared its conclusion, Sarah faced a difficult decision. Most of the men responsible for her father's murder were dead, and those who were still alive were too old and infirm to face meaningful prosecution. But the truth about Samuel Washington's life and death needed to be told, not just for the sake of her family's closure, but as a testament to his courage and a warning about the ongoing reality of domestic violence and the people who profit from it. The story that emerged from Thompson's investigation was one of heroism and villainy, of ordinary people doing extraordinary things in the face of systematic evil. Samuel Washington had not simply been a pastor who helped people. He had been a freedom fighter who challenged one of the most entrenched forms of oppression in American society. His death had been the price of that challenge, but his legacy had survived in the lives of the people he had saved and the example he had set for future generations. The packed sanctuary of Magnolia Grove Baptist Church on a sweltering July morning in 2023 bore witness to something unprecedented in the congregation's 70-year history. Nearly 400 people filled every pew, lined the walls, and spilled out into the fellowship hall where speakers carried the service to those who couldn't find seats. They had come from across Georgia and beyond, family members, former congregation members who had moved away decades earlier, civil rights activists, domestic violence advocates, and journalists drawn by a story that had captured national attention. But most importantly, they had come to finally hear the truth about Reverend Samuel Washington. Sarah Washington Miller stood behind the same pulpit where her father had delivered his final sermon 50 years earlier, looking out at faces that reflected every emotion from grief to anger to profound relief. Among them were her brothers Marcus and David, both now in their 60s and struggling to process the revelations that had upended everything they thought they knew about their family's history. Marcus, the former detective who had spent decades searching for answers, sat in the front row with tears streaming down his face as he finally understood why his investigation had never yielded results. David, now a pastor himself, held his wife's hand tightly as he prepared to hear the story of a father he had never really known, but had spent a lifetime trying to emulate. The past month had been a whirlwind of media attention and legal developments following Detective Thompson's investigation. The discovery of Samuel's letter and Mary Ellen Patterson's testimony had prompted the Georgia Bureau of Investigation to officially reopen the case, though they acknowledged that meaningful prosecution was unlikely given the advanced age or death of most of the perpetrators. Harold Patterson had died in 1995, taking his secrets to the grave. County Commissioner Frank Morrison had passed away in 2001, having served in local government for 30 years after participating in Samuel's murder. The other conspirators were similarly beyond the reach of earthly justice. But the investigation had yielded something perhaps more valuable than prosecutions: a complete picture of Samuel Washington's heroic final months and the systematic campaign of violence that had silenced him. Detective Thompson's report, released to the public just days earlier, contained detailed evidence of the Freedom Railroad's operations, the conspiracy that led to Samuel's murder, and the decades-long cover-up that had followed. The report had sparked renewed interest in cold cases involving civil rights activists and had prompted several other law enforcement agencies to re-examine unsolved disappearances from the 1970s and 1980s. More immediately, the revelations had transformed the way Samuel's story was understood by his community and family. No longer was he the pastor who had mysteriously vanished, leaving behind questions about his character and commitment. He was now recognized as a martyr who had died protecting the vulnerable, a man whose courage had cost him everything but whose principles had remained unshakable even in the face of torture and death. 50 years ago today, Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed sanctuary, my father delivered his final sermon from this very pulpit. He spoke about faith in the darkness, about trusting God even when we cannot see the path ahead. He had no way of knowing that his congregation was hearing his last words, but somehow those words seemed to anticipate the long journey of faith that this community would have to walk in his absence. Sarah paused, looking out at the sea of faces that included several people whose lives had been directly touched by the Freedom Railroad. Mary Ellen Patterson sat in the third row, now using a walker but determined to be present for this moment of truth. Beside her sat Lucy Patterson Williams, the daughter whose safety had been worth Samuel's life, now a grandmother herself and a successful advocate for children's rights. In the back of the sanctuary, Thomas Grant's son Robert sat with his own family, still wrestling with the knowledge that his Uncle William had been one of Samuel's killers. For 5 decades, this community has carried the burden of unanswered questions, Sarah continued. We wondered where Samuel Washington had gone, why he had left, what had driven a loving father and devoted pastor to abandon everything he held dear. Some of you never doubted his character, maintaining faith in his goodness, even when there was no evidence to support that faith. Others, understandably, began to wonder if perhaps we had idealized a man who was more human and flawed than we wanted to admit. The congregation stirred as Sarah acknowledged the divisions that Samuel's disappearance had created within the church and community. For years, whispered conversations had centered on theories about what had really happened. Had Samuel run away with another woman? Had he stolen church funds and fled? Had he simply been unable to handle the pressures of ministry and family life? These questions had poisoned relationships and undermined the unity that Samuel had worked so hard to build. Today, we finally know the truth, Sarah said, her voice growing stronger. Samuel Washington did not abandon his family or his congregation. He was murdered by men who saw his compassion as a threat to their power, who viewed his commitment to protecting the vulnerable as an attack on their way of life. He died because he refused to stop helping women and children escape from violence. He died because he would not betray the trust of people who had nowhere else to turn. Sarah then began to read from her father's final letter, sharing with the congregation the words that had been hidden for 50 years. As she described the Freedom Railroad and the dangerous work Samuel had been doing in secret, gasps and murmurs rippled through the sanctuary. Many congregants were hearing these details for the first time, finally understanding why their beloved pastor had seemed increasingly burdened in his final months. The man we mourned was even greater than we knew, Sarah said as she concluded the reading. While we saw only his gentle spirit and pastoral care, he was also operating a network that saved dozens of families from violence and abuse. While we knew him as a preacher of love and compassion, he was also a freedom fighter who risked everything to turn those principles into action. The service included testimonies from several people whose lives had been touched by Samuel's work. Mary Ellen Patterson stood slowly, supported by her daughter, and addressed the congregation in a voice that shook with emotion but carried clearly through the sanctuary. "Your pastor saved my life and my daughter's life," she said simply. "Without him, we would both be dead. Harold would have killed us eventually. I know that now. Samuel Washington gave us a future, and everything good that has happened in our lives since 1973 exists because of his courage." Lucy Patterson Williams followed her mother to the podium, sharing how Samuel's sacrifice had allowed her to grow up free from abuse, to attend college, to build a career helping other children in crisis situations. "I never knew your pastor personally," she said, "but his legacy shaped my entire life. Every child I've helped, every family I've counseled, every policy I've influenced, it all traces back to the night Samuel Washington chose to risk everything to save strangers." But perhaps the most powerful testimony came from Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, now in her 80s, but still sharp and articulate, who had driven from Atlanta to attend the service. Dr. Morrison had been Samuel's primary contact in the Freedom Railroad network, the psychiatrist who had coordinated safe houses and new identities for escaping families. Her presence at the service represented a living link to the network that Samuel had died protecting. Samuel Washington was the heart of our operation, Dr. Morrison told the congregation. He was the one who made initial contact with families in crisis, who convinced terrified women that escape was possible, who provided the spiritual strength that sustained people through the dangerous journey to freedom. Without him, the Freedom Railroad in this region never would have existed. His death didn't just end a life, it ended a lifeline for countless people who desperately needed help. Dr. Morrison went on to reveal that the Freedom Railroad had been part of a larger national network of activists and religious leaders who were working to address the crisis of domestic violence in an era when such abuse was rarely acknowledged or prosecuted. Samuel's murder had been part of a systematic campaign to destroy these networks, and his death had contributed to a dark period when help for abuse victims became increasingly difficult to find. But networks like ours weren't destroyed permanently, Dr. Morrison continued. They evolved, became more professional, developed into the domestic violence shelters and advocacy organizations that exist today. Samuel Washington's death was a tragedy, but his vision survived. Every woman who finds safety in a shelter today, every child who escapes an abusive home, every family that gets a fresh start, they are all part of Samuel's legacy. As the service continued, Sarah announced that the Samuel Washington Foundation, originally established by her sister Angela, would be expanding its mission to include support for cold case investigations of crimes against civil rights activists and domestic violence advocates. The foundation would also fund training for law enforcement officers on recognizing and investigating cases of systematic abuse and corruption. Justice delayed is not always justice denied, Sarah declared. While we cannot prosecute the men who killed our father, we can ensure that their methods and motives are fully exposed. We can educate future generations about the ongoing reality of domestic violence and the people who profit from it. We can honor the memory of everyone who has died fighting for the vulnerable and the voiceless. The service also included the announcement of a new scholarship program for young people pursuing careers in social work, law enforcement, or advocacy. The scholarships would be funded partly by book and movie deals that had emerged from the media attention surrounding Samuel's story, ensuring that his legacy would continue to create opportunities for people committed to serving others. But perhaps the most significant announcement came when Sarah revealed that Magnolia Grove Baptist Church would be partnering with several other congregations to restart the Freedom Railroad as a modern network of support for domestic violence survivors. The new network would operate openly, with full cooperation from law enforcement and social service agencies, but it would be inspired by the same principles that had motivated Samuel's underground operation 50 years earlier. "We cannot bring Samuel Washington back," Sarah said, as the service neared its conclusion, "but we can ensure that his work continues. We can make certain that no family faces violence alone, that no child grows up believing that abuse is normal, that no woman dies because she couldn't find help. This is how we honor the dead, by continuing their mission." As Sarah prepared to deliver her closing remarks, she looked out at a congregation that had been transformed by the truth. The questions that had haunted Magnolia Grove Baptist Church for 50 years had finally been answered, but more importantly, the community had rediscovered its sense of purpose and mission. Samuel's death had been a tragedy, but his life and sacrifice had inspired a new generation of activists and advocates. "My father's final sermon was about faith in the darkness," Sarah concluded. He could not have known that his congregation would need that faith to sustain them through 50 years of uncertainty and grief, but somehow his words proved prophetic. This community kept faith with Samuel Washington's memory even when they didn't know the full truth about his sacrifice. You honored his legacy even when you couldn't understand his disappearance. You kept his vision alive even when his voice was silenced. Sarah looked directly at the space where her father had once stood, 50 years earlier, delivering words that would prove to be his last. Today, we can finally say that Samuel Washington did not die in vain. His sacrifice led to this moment of truth, this renewal of purpose, this commitment to continue the work he died protecting. The darkness could not extinguish the light he lit, and that light will continue to shine for generations to come. As the congregation rose for the final hymn, the same blessed assurance that had concluded Samuel's last service, the voices that filled the sanctuary carried a different quality than they had 50 years earlier. These were voices that had been tested by doubt and strengthened by truth, voices that understood the cost of faith and the power of sacrifice. They sang not just of assurance, but of resurrection, the resurrection of truth, the resurrection of purpose, and the resurrection of a community that had finally found its way out of the wilderness of uncertainty. Outside the church, the July sun blazed down on the cemetery where Clara Washington rested beside an empty grave that had been prepared for a husband who never came home. But the emptiness of that grave no longer represented abandonment or mystery. It had become a symbol of sacrifice, a reminder that some people's final resting place is not in the ground, but in the lives they touch and the legacy they leave behind. Samuel Washington's body might never be recovered from its concrete tomb, but his spirit had finally been set free, released from 50 years of silence to inspire a new generation of freedom fighters who would carry his torch into an uncertain but hopeful future.